Cool. So yeah, Alex has already gone through CSS1, which is CSS fundamentals. And today we'll be talking about some more like advanced CSS concepts. So yeah, and here is our agenda today. We're going to be covering 6 topics. And then at the end, we'll introduce the first project, which is very exciting and fun. So look forward to that. Yeah, so I guess before we begin, just want to make sure you guys know that if you have questions in the middle of this, feel free to like raise your hand, interrupt me, or just interrupt me. Or if you want to send a question in the chat, you can also do that. If you're more comfortable, you can also just send me like private questions in the chat and I can just answer it out loud. But yeah, I just want to make sure you guys are all on the same page and I'm not like going past something that you guys don't understand. So yeah, let's start. Okay. Cool. So our first topic today is positioning. So basically what I'm going to do for this lecture is I'm going to be showing you guys slides, and then as I talk through every topic, I'll be like doing a demo like along the way on the side to kind of demonstrate, you know, what these properties actually do. So cool. Positioning is basically the art of placing things on your screen. Which is kind of arbitrary, but basically there's 5 different positioning properties. And if we go into our positioning CSS file, we'll be able to demonstrate some of those. So position is just another property shown right here, just like everything else. Yeah, so the default position property is static. Static basically just lays everything out in the normal flow of a web page, that like from top to bottom, and every element kind of takes up like its own new line. And the interesting thing about static, so we can change this here, is that you actually can't really control like what this box does when it's position static, because it just kind of has like a mind of its own. So for example, like if we want to give it like a top of like 10 pixels, so in theory that should like bring it up. It doesn't do that because, you know, it's not affected by any of these properties and you can't really move it. So a lot of times static is good for stuff that, you know, like isn't require too much like fancy positioning, and you just kind of need it to fall in like the logical place. But a lot of times it's nice to use some of the other properties too. So next we have relative, which is a very common one that you'll find. This one basically positions the element relative to its like original default static position. So you can see right here, static makes it look like this. If we change the position to relative, like we can now move it around using like top, bottom, left, right. So let's say we want all of this stuff to like move down by 50 pixels. We can set the top to 50, and then you'll see that they all slide down from their default position. So yeah, that's what position relative means. Next, we have position fixed. So this one is really useful for fixing nav bars, for example, like to the top of your screen, or like if you have a button that you always want to have shown on the page. Then this is how you do it. Like sometimes at the bottom of pages, there's like the chatbot icon where you can like reach out for help, for example. So yeah, in our boxes, we have, so in our boxes, we have 3 of these. And the second one is the fixed box. So in box fixed here, we can give it position fixed. And then let's say we want it to stay on like the bottom left of the screen, for example. We can give the bottom property 10 pixels and then the left property 10 pixels. Then you will see here that this box, this fixed box, basically just stays like at this very bottom, wherever you scroll. So basically that's what it means by position relative to the viewport. Viewport is just like the window that you're displaying the website on. And this last point says it doesn't leave a space in the page where it statically is located. So basically like between these boxes, there's no gap anymore. It's kind of like taken this element and moved it like entirely away from this order. So everything else just kind of falls into its static position as if this wasn't here. So yeah, this is fixed. Another thing to note is that fixed elements like always will fall on top of everything else. Which kind of makes sense because like if you have something fixed, you don't want it to like ever be covered by something, because the point is that you always want to see it, right? So that's kind of like a caveat, is that, you know, whenever you fix something, it'll always stay on top. So yeah, that's what a fixed element looks like. Cool. And then I think second to last, we have absolute. Absolute is really good for positioning things where you want stuff to kind of go on top of each other, but you want to have like some control of like what goes on top of each other. So let's see, here we have like this box. This is a green box down here. Now there's one div that says I'm here, and then another div that says but I'm here. And then if we go down here, this is dude 1, dude 2. They're kind of fighting to like get the spotlight. But yeah, we have this box right here. We can collapse that, it's not important. For both of the dudes, we can give them absolute positioning. You'll notice that they just start to like overlay on top of each other. And yeah, basically like sometimes you want to overlay text over an image, right? And there's no easy way to do that when you have like relative positioning. So with absolute, you can kind of just tell them like, hey, go here, and like don't question it. You can also give them like top bottom properties, which wouldn't really be useful in this setting, but okay, ignore what I just did. But yeah, and then right here, we see that you can use z-index, which is another CSS property, to layer one on top of the other. So z-index is basically like, if you think of like a 3-dimensional graph in like math, z is like the height away from like the page, right? So basically the higher the z-index, like the more on top it'll be. So right now we notice that like the black one is behind. If we want to bring it up on top, then we can give it like a high z-index. Let's say 2, and then it'll like come over on the top, which is nice. Absolute is nice to create more like specific niche layouts, but also like with absolute, you can't really give it any margin, and like the parent element doesn't really have like too much of control over like the way that an absolute position element is placed. So usually you won't have to use this, but in the case that you do, this is always here. So yeah. Next, lastly, we have position sticky. This one is, I've never really used this one, but I can see why it's helpful. So right here we have a sticky box, which is this first one. And if we give it position sticky, basically what it does is that it'll stay relative until it hits like a certain point. So right here, basically, if I give it a top of 20 pixels, as I scroll the page, it'll stay like, how you think it will, but once it hits 20 pixels, it'll kind of fix on the screen. So it's kind of like a toggle between relative and fixed positioning. So let's see that work. Let's give it a top of like 10 pixels. And then you'll notice that if I scroll, then this top one just kind of stays in place. Kind of fun. Not super useful, but like I can see a use case for it. But yeah, that's all of the positioning property choices. Not all of the choices, but more of the commonly used ones. Do you guys have any questions on this property? If so, please drop in the chat or just ask out loud. Yeah, so nav bars, usually nav bars can just stay fixed. Like if you want it to like stay at the top of the page, like I assume that, like, let's pretend this purple thing is a nav bar, right? So like if it's fixed, it'll just kind of, like start like this, right? And it'll never move. But with sticky, like what happens is that you kind of have to scroll down to the position in the page where this is true, and then it'll happen. So usually, like if you want to fix the nav bar to the top of the page, use position fixed instead of sticky, so that like it kind of remains consistent. So yeah. Yeah, what does the 2 next to z-index signify? So basically the z-index tells you like what things should go on top, and basically the higher the number, the kind of like further up it's lifted. So this is just like the measurement. So for example, like if we wanted second guy to come back on top, then we can give him a z-index of something higher than 2, like 10. The numbers are really arbitrary. It's just a way to like be able to compare. And then you'll see that like the white is now on top of the black one. So yeah. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Okay, if no one else has questions, then I will move on to the next part, which is display. Display and positioning are a little bit tricky sometimes. Like sometimes, you know, it's kind of hard to distinguish what like the difference between the two properties are. But basically how I would describe it is positioning kind of deals with like how an element itself is just, wait, no, backwards. Positioning deals with the way that an element kind of interacts with other elements around it. So for example, relative, like it's relative to other things. But with display, it kind of just deals with like the way that elements work by themselves. So yeah, I'll kind of show you guys more what that means. It's a little bit confusing right now. But yeah, display is making stuff like kind of work together. Cool. So to start off, so we have 4 display properties here. And then one that I'll talk about more in depth later after this slide. But yeah, let's go through like the 4 most common ones. I believe there are more, but these are more common. So here we have a bunch of circles. Ooh, this is a big page. So yeah, let's start with display block. So I want you guys to notice here, like in this span, we have this sentence, right? It says, I have a, and then there's a circle, which is this circle in me. And yeah, it's basically a sentence with a circle inside of it, right? So right now, the circle itself, circle in line here is set with display block. Display block basically means that your element, like when you inject a new element into the page, it does the default, which basically just takes up a whole new line, right? Because usually like what we want to happen, like in this scenario, we want the circles to kind of like be in the sentence, right? To kind of be in the same line. But since it's given like a default display of block, basically when this element is added onto the web page, it'll take up a whole new line as if it's like a new sentence, right? So that's what block does. If you want something to go in line, like I was describing it, then you use the inline property, which seeing here, it smushes the circle because it's now fitting it in the same line. But you know, now it's all together in like one sentence, which this doesn't really make sense anymore, but it's just to illustrate that, you know, it kind of gets shoved together now. So yeah, that's kind of the difference between block and inline. And then we have like a special display mode, which is grid. This one, like, I wouldn't really recommend using grid because better options exist. Grid is a little bit hard to configure sometimes, especially when like you're sizing up and down your page and like you want it to kind of be dynamic. But you know, sometimes it's useful. So we have these orange circles here in wrapper grid. They say I'm circle. And if we uncomment this, we're giving it display grid, and then grid template columns basically signifies like the number of columns that you have. And what this means is that, so like, I won't go into details of why we use this function, but like, just know that like this is a general format you'll have to follow if you want to use grids. So basically it's saying I want 2 columns, and then 1 FR just means 1 fraction, meaning that like each column takes up like 1 unit of fraction, which is like 100 divided by 2, right? So they take up 50% each. And yeah, so we have here 2 columns of 4 circles. So it's a 2 by 2 grid of circles. Yeah, it's not super complicated. Slash, like you probably won't need to use this too much, but it's there. And then if you want to basically remove an element from the page, which sometimes is really helpful for like, let's say you have like a nav bar on desktop that like spans this whole width, right? But then on mobile, you want it to change into like a mobile nav bar. Then like you can, at some point, like when the screen size gets small enough, which we'll talk about later, you can give the desktop nav bar a display none, and then start to display like the mobile nav bar. That's just one example of how you could use it. But basically you can, let's say I want all of these maroon circles to disappear. So I'm just gonna say display none, and then they should all just leave besides this one. But yeah, that's how you get stuff to disappear. which you guys will see a use case for once we get into like breakpoints and responsiveness. So yeah, next we have the most used display property, which is flex. Flexbox is super useful. A lot of people, like are big proponents of using like Bootstrap, like some like Material UI, different types of styling. But personally, like I've just used Flexbox throughout my development journey, and it's never really given me a problem because display flex is like a really, really easy way to make flexible and responsive layout structure without having to like specify too much. And let me show you guys an example of why this is very useful. So we have a bunch of like these blue circles at the very bottom of the screen, and they're kind of just here as they should. But here we have this wrapper which contains all of these blue ones. And basically like the previous display elements, so these top two are given to like the element itself. So like when you give something display inline, it'll apply inline display to its own element. But for grid and flex, it's just kind of confusing. For grid and flex, they'll apply that property to like their children. So for example, like we gave this wrapper display grid, wrapper grid, and then it like puts its children elements into a grid. So same thing with flex. So yeah, let me show you guys how you can use Flexbox. So basically Flexbox, you say display flex, and by default, the flex direction is row. No, am I dumb? Yeah, no, by default it's row. We can see here that everything just kind of goes into a row. And then if we want it to go into column, then we can also do that. Yeah, but we don't need that right now because that looks the same. But yeah, like basically it's super nice because you can give it a ton of different properties. For example, like you can justify like the stuff inside of it. So notice like right here, the text inside is like kind of jank. So if we give circle flex a flex property, the circle div is like the circle itself, and then inside of it just contains like text. Then we can say, let's say we want to center the text, we can say justify content center, and then align items center. And then everything in theory does not. Wait, let's see. Circle flex. What if we, okay, see, I don't know why it's doing that. But in theory, if you do it correctly, this stuff should, wait, what? Okay, now this is really pissing me off. You know what? Ignore my mistakes. I'll figure this one out later. But yeah, like basically with Flex, you can justify a lot of the stuff center inside of itself. I think like here actually is a good example. So for example, like you notice how these words are centered inside of like the circles, and that's done by doing this. I'm really not sure why like this isn't working, so I'm just gonna ignore it for now. But notice that like giving this start will change the look of it. It'll like center it to the start. And then giving it end, for example, you can like put stuff on the end. Okay, I guess it's just not gonna listen to me. Okay, that's weird. But yeah, it's really nice. On the side here, we have like a bunch of different ways that you can place stuff. And this is like a really, really useful property to know, like really, really know, because it's super useful for a lot of situations, and it has like a lot of different options in it. So basically there's like this game, it's called Flexbox Froggy, and it's gonna be a part of your first project submission, I believe. But basically like, basically it's a way to practice your Flexbox, meaning that it's gonna give you a bunch of scenario. Why is it so? So how do you change a nav bar for, oh, sorry, I missed this code. Okay. So for nav bar, that's something I'll go through at the last topic, which is media queries and breakpoints. So like basically the idea is that like once your screen size goes down to like a certain size, the browser will just kind of assume that you're on mobile, and then because of that, it'll like display certain things as none and then display other things as like block or inline. And I'll talk about like the specifics on how to actually do that at the very end. So yeah. Any other questions on display? Okay. Awesome. Now we're done with this. Okay, beautiful. Next topic we have is Cascade. So Cascade and specificity is basically just a fancy way of like resolving conflicts between like two different selectors, for example, that like try to style the same element. And I'll show you guys how that works here. And the cascade basically just means like certain CSS properties will be picked up from like previous definitions of it. So yeah, let's first talk about cascade and how that works. So basically the core concept is that classes inherit parent class properties. So here in our HTML, we can see once upon a time there was a scary frog, and it's a paragraph. And then inside here we have frog, which is wrapped by a span. So basically the span is the child of this paragraph, which is the parent. And notice here that we have, okay, so paragraph right now is, let's give it a color of like blue. And notice that like, even though this word frog is in a span itself, so it's like technically its own element, because we never specified like what color the child div should have, basically it will inherit like the parent's properties. So yeah, we notice here that if you give it like a color of green, as frogs are, then you can see how it changes. But yeah, so unless you specify something, it'll basically just assume based off of like previous styling what it should be, which sometimes is nice, but you know, sometimes you want to be able to see like where certain properties are coming from. So yeah, another thing to note is that order in CSS classes matter, meaning that, you know, if I do another like selector here for frog and then I give it color, let's find a fun one, yellow green. Basically it'll take the last one even though previously we specified it to be green. So yeah, just that's like a good nuance to know of so that you're not confused later down the line. Yeah, so that's a cascade. It basically properties like cascade down to down to child elements, kind of like inheritance in like object-oriented programming or something. But yeah, so next we have the topic of specificity. So basically specificity is just how specific a selector is. So this is a selector, paragraph selector, and basically for every like selector we can kind of measure how specific it is, because a lot of times, like, you know, one element on the page is defined by more than one selector. So for example, like this is both a paragraph and has a class paragraph. So we could, you know, we could give this just P and then dot paragraph, and it would kind of style the same thing. But yeah, since there's different ways that you can style one element, though, sometimes it gets confusing when like two selectors kind of conflict. And sometimes, you know, it's hard to dig through like what's causing certain problems in your styling. So basically, when you're looking at specificity, there's like a certain number method that you can use. And basically, the higher the number, the more powerful it is, and the higher the number, it'll override like a lower number. So basically, for every selector, we can go by these rules. Side note that like this rule actually isn't like something that's built into CSS. It's just a way for you to kind of visualize like when conflicts arise, like why it might be happening. So like these aren't like hard and fast rules that are built into the technology. It's just kind of like a convention that you can follow for ease. But yeah, basically, you know, we have all these different selectors. For example, the universal selector has like a weight of 1. It's like in the ones place. And then tags, which are things like paragraph, div. These have a specificity number of 10. Classes like paragraph and box have hundreds. IDs are more powerful than classes. They have the thousands place, and then the style tag, which is like the inline styling. So for example, actually I don't know why I put it in the tag, but like for example, you can specify here like different types of styling, and inline styling will always override external style sheets. So that one's important to know. But yeah, basically like we can go through a few examples. We have this box here that says hello friends, and we have two ways that we can select it, right? So we could either select it by its name, like its class name, which is box, or we can select it by its tag type, which is div, right? So in this example, you know, we have box and div here. So let's see, if I gave this color green, what do you guys think would happen? Like would this be red or would it be green? And feel free to drop it in the chat. This one's not super complicated, but yes, that is correct. It would be red because as we see here, this box class has a value of 100, and then this div, which is a tag, has a value of 10. So 100 wins out over 10, meaning that it stays red. So yeah, next we have this this controversial sentence, spam is fine uncooked, which I personally believe to be true, but a lot of people don't, which is fine. But let's remove this. So here we have one way of selecting it, which is selecting it via the tag type, which is a div, as well as an ID. And then the second way of selecting it is just by its ID. So what do you guys think will happen here? Which one will win? Okay, so there's so much suspense. Basically, it'll turn the tag, I mean, not the tag, it'll turn the element green. It'll give it a green background because here we selected by tag type as well as ID, which gives it a value of 1010, and then just ID gives it a value of 1000. By as specific, oh, yeah. So like, sorry, I think I kind of explained it wrong, but basically like these are places. So like for every one tag, it adds like 1/10 place, if that makes sense. So yeah, like you basically add them together. Sorry if that wasn't clear earlier, but yeah, like here we notice that it has like a div, which is tens, and then 1000 from the ID. But yeah, and then last example we have is an element that has two classes, like and subscribe. Let's see. Okay, so first we can see that, you know, this box here, which that name doesn't make sense, but it has red text because we gave it a color red. And then if we specify it by box and words, which is both of its class names, if we make it blue, then what we'll see is that it actually turns blue, shocking, because we're specifying it by two classes, which is 200s, versus one class, which is just 100. So yeah, this is just like a fun, nice, easy way to measure these things. Obviously, like some things don't add up. Like for example, if you had like 100 classes in your element and then one ID, the ID would technically still win over, even though like they're both 1000 now. So just remember that like it's not a rule built into CSS. It's just nice to know, and like usually you wouldn't have 100 classes, so you don't really have to worry about that. But yeah, so yeah, that's all I have for specificity and cascade. Does anyone have any questions on that? This one's a little bit confusing.
Oh, since you said that this is like kind of like not exactly a CSS rule, like if you had 20 tags, would that not override one class?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, it would not, just because classes like are technically just like stronger, regardless of how many tags there are. But you know, like in a normal situation, you usually wouldn't have to like worry about having 20 of one thing, or hopefully you wouldn't have to have that. But yeah, so what the numbers represent. So yeah, numbers represent the specificity. So like this 200 right here is the specificity value of this selector. And then 100 is the specificity of this selector. So basically, when two selectors are styling the same thing, the specificity number just allows us to compare their strengths and see which one will actually work. So like, for example, here, this box words, we have this, whoops, we have this here, this element called box words, and then we can style it either like this, or we can style it like this. And we notice that this one is 200, this one is 100. So 200 wins out and it ultimately turns blue. So yeah, it's just like a nice convention to compare everything. And yeah, the ones place is the asterisk, which is the universal selector. So it affects everything. This is usually the only thing I'll ever have to use that for. Consider this like the CSS file, like boilerplate code, because things can get confusing if you don't have this. But yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Cool. So next, we are almost done. We have pseudo classes and animation. So this one is fun. I remember when I first learned this, I couldn't stop putting stupid like animations into my websites, but they're fun to like play around with. So basically, let's start with pseudo classes. So it's a big word, but basically, pseudo class is just used to define a special state of an element. So for example, we have hover, focus, first child. Those are some examples of a pseudo class, and they're basically denoted by having a colon before them, and they're set here in the CSS after like the selector value or the selector name. So let's see a few examples. Okay, so notice here that we have a bunch of ovals. They're all of the oval class. And we have this pseudo class here called first child, which basically is assigned to like a child element, and then of the child elements, like basically of its siblings, it grabs like the first one that appears in the DOM, which is like the one at the very top. So in this example, without this here, everything kind of just like looks the same, right? Like they all look the same. And then if we give the first child selector these properties, then it will, oops, why is that? Then it will turn like different, which yeah, sometimes that's nice to have. And then same thing with last child, you can do that. And then a fun one is hover, because you can give certain things like hover effects, which like sometimes are a nice like subtle way to spice up a website. And notice here that I have given the last child. Oh, also you can combine pseudo classes. So like you can say like when I hover only on the last child should this happen, so that like it doesn't happen to all of them. So you can combine them and it kind of logically works out the way it should. So yeah, this last one, when we hover over it, what happens is that it rotates 360 degrees, which actually is a bad example because you can't see that. But this first one, it, you know, when you hover over it, it scales to 1.4. And then you can also combine these and say like rotate 20 degrees. And then it'll rotate here if you ever wanted to do that. But yeah, and then basically this transform basically is usually put into like the pseudo class to tell it what to do when this special event happens. So basically the nice thing about transform is that you can use it with the transition property to kind of create cool animations that like ease in and out. So right now you can see it's like really choppy, it just kind of jumps. but sometimes like we want it to take like a little bit longer and to be like more smooth. So we can use transform plus transition to specify how we want it to work. So basically the transform property goes into the pseudo class, and then the transition property goes into like the original element. So like the non-special state element. So basically oval gets this transition value. And what this means is that, so this is a little bit confusing, but basically like one element can have a bunch of different like types of transforms, right? Like as we've seen here, there's one type of transform is scale, which makes it bigger or smaller. Then another type of transform is rotate. And then there's like things like translate, I think. So yeah, basically there's a bunch of different types of transform. And what this all means is that like for all of the elements that are of class oval, like for all of their types of transforms, you want to give them like these properties. And basically, I think this is the speed of the animation. So if we reload, you can see how it like kind of goes slower now. And then ease is just like the effect. You can do ease in, ease out. It's very subtle, like you can really barely tell, but it gives it like kind of an acceleration almost. And then I think you can also give it like a delay. Nice. Yeah, so like it waits like 1 second before it reacts to any like pseudo class changes. And pseudo classes are only included in the CSS. So like here, like you can see that everything is just oval. But when you say like hover on oval, it will, let's see, if you give like the hover pseudo class, then it'll give this effect to like all of them. So yeah, yeah, this is nice. This one, now you can see it because it rotates slower now. But yeah, these are fun to play around with. They're super easy to configure because like you really just have to give it the transition property in the original state, and then in the special state, give it a transform property, and then it'll just basically do what you tell it to. And yeah, there's a lot of different types of like, you can translate it only by X, and then it'll move over, hopefully. Yeah, fun. I don't know. Yeah, it's cool.
What if you wanted to make the last one, the youngest one,
Mhm.
like slower, but keep all the rest the same?
Oh yeah. Let's see. So if you want to do that, like in this specific case, you could just say, let's see. You could give it, I don't know if you can actually do this, but let's see, you could do rotate. Let's see if this works. Oh gosh, it's not doing it. Okay, ignore. So I think in this case, you'd probably want to just give it like a different property, or sorry, not give it a different property, give it like a different class name, and then from there you can specify a different like type of transition. Because I'm not super sure how you would actually split these up, because I don't think you can have two of the same, especially since all of these have the same class. But I think like I'd recommend just probably giving this like another type of like give it slow, and then in oval slow you can say transition, and then give it like a longer transition. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hacky, but that's probably the easiest way to do it, just so you don't like confuse yourself with the different like transitions that you have. So yeah, and I think that's all for yeah. Does anyone else have questions?
Oh, I had a question on the pseudo classes. So I kind of understand how hover is like the state.
Yeah.
But could you go over like first child and last child?
Oh yeah. So basically, okay. Imagine like these ovals are like all the children of this parent called oval parent. So basically, like oval first child basically looks for like the sibling that okay, by sibling, I mean like the other ovals that are inside of like this div, right? So it'll say like, oh, okay, let's pretend I'm the middle child, right? And then I'm gonna look through like the other siblings that are in the same parent and look for like the first occurrence of this oval class. So that's what first child does. And usually like the first occurrence will be the one that comes up at the very top. And then last child is the one that comes up at the very bottom.
Okay, so you didn't define, are these like default things?
Yeah, they're built into CSS. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Wait, is there one for the mid, like in between?
So I don't think there is one for in between, just because like it's kind of just lumped into like everything else. So like as long as you can specify like first child, last child, then everything else in the middle like tends to be similar. I think like what's really useful about first child and last child is like sometimes like you want to give like more margin to the one on top, right? Without affecting like the rest of the ones at the bottom. And then if you want to do that, you can just say like first child and give it like a bigger margin. No. Yeah, and then it'll, okay, well, that's not helpful. But yeah, you can like just specify like special properties of it. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, for sure. Okay, cool. Okay, last thing for today. We have, well, second to last thing, we have something called media queries, which is very nice for when it comes to changing the layout of a website based on like the screen size that you're on. Because you can imagine like, for example, like webdevatberkeley, like their website, like the layout of it changes based on like the size of the screen you're on. So notice how like that, the hamburger thing like appeared. So yeah, this is basically done using media queries, which kind of sound a little bit fancy right now, but basically what they do is in your CSS file, you can specify this media query, which is illustrated right here. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with the nav bar. So let's say like once your screen size reaches mobile, you don't want like your nav bar to kind of be like this big long thing that like spans everything, because then it'd be really small and like no one can really read it. So to accommodate for that, basically we give it breakpoints. So in the CSS is basically where you style everything, right? So it kind of makes sense that it's in here. So what this is doing, it's basically saying like everything should follow these rules when you're on like a standard desktop size, right? But as soon as like your screen size reaches a width of 550 pixels or below, it'll give it a different set of properties. But if it's not specified in here, it'll inherit everything that is up here, right? So that's why like right now, if we size it, if we size the screen, like nothing really changes. It just kind of like squishes down. But let's say that, you know, to illustrate like media queries working, you can, let's say, for each thing, let's give it a background color of slate blue, very specific. So now when you size down your screen, at one point when it reaches that specified breakpoint, it'll turn everything blue. Well, that's more at purple, but you get the point, right? Like it changes things. And a super useful application of this, like this usually isn't that useful because like, hey, you're never gonna really want to do that. But we'll keep it there for illustration of the media query. But basically like, let's say you want all of this stuff to go into a column when it reaches mobile, right? Because a lot of times like on desktop, you'll have like rows and rows of items, but then on mobile, you want it to kind of squish into like one column. So here we can say, instead of flex direction being row, you can give it column. And then if we reload, at one point when it turns blue, everything will go into a column. So this is really nice. Obviously, like this is super powerful. Like for every website that I've made, there's always been breakpoints when you're using like basic CSS or Sass, because that's like really the only and probably the best way to specify like how you want things to change when you come to like mobile versions. And yeah, so what I just did here only is only when display is flex, which is up here. But of course, like if you want to change other properties of it, like for example, thing doesn't have display flex, but oh, actually it does. Okay. But basically what I'm saying is that like only this is dependent on being display flex, but everything else is just kind of like works. But yeah, that's another example of why like Flexbox is super nice, because now like instead of having to change like the width and like the layout of every specific element on the page, when you go down to mobile, you can just say like, okay, like put it into a column now, and it does it for you, which is very handy. And I found myself using this a lot, so it's important to know. And what I was talking about earlier with the nav bar, let's say I want this one thing. Let's say it's green. It's a green one. Green. Background color green. So now it's just one guy's green. And for some reason, like when we go on mobile, we don't want him to show up anymore, which is not nice, but you know, that's just what we have to do. But now we can say, hey, like when we get down to mobile size, we want thing green to just like disappear, right? We don't want to be his friend anymore. And you'll see that like he just kind of leaves the equation and everything else just says as a bad example. You know, everyone else just kind of goes without, like he was never there. But yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about with the nav bar example. So pretend, let's go back to the Web at Berkeley example. Pretend that like this nav bar up here is one element, which it actually is. It's just like a nav bar element, right, that we created. And then let's say when you size down to mobile, like obviously you don't want this to show up anymore. So what happens is that this nav bar disappears, and then this hamburger menu shows up. And when you're not in this mode, then the hamburger menu is on display none. So you kind of like toggle the display nones between two elements that you want to switch out. In this website, it's actually using like Bootstrap, which does this for you automatically, but I hate Bootstrap. So I usually just like kind of manually do it by using media queries and display none. So yeah, hopefully that like clarifies more what I was talking about earlier. But yeah, yeah, these are some common breakpoints when it comes to media queries. You know, obviously for every site, it's a little bit different, like which ones you really need to use. Because a lot of times, like, you know, your website, like for example, this homepage like looks the same on an iPad versus a desktop, so you don't really have to change anything. But if you're looking for common breakpoints across like different types of devices, and you can look here. And I sent these slides, I think, so you can reference these later. But yeah, cool. So that's actually the end of like the most of like the content that we're going over. So does anyone have questions on media queries and breakpoints?
Just on the thing you were saying about the navbar. So like if you wanted to do it inside of like the media queries, like what's like the command, like what do you use to actually change it, I guess?
Okay. Yeah, for sure. So let's just pretend that this code is for this website, right? So let's say we have some navbar up here that represents like, let's call it desktop navbar. And then we have mobile. So let's say that desktop navbar represents like this navbar up here, right? Then mobile navbar represents this. So basically right here, we want to say, since we're not in a media query, basically everything is like normal, like desktop size, and we can give the mobile navbar a display of none, right? Because we don't really want it to show up when this desktop one is here. And then this one has display, let's just give it like a default like block display, right? So now we can see that, pretending that this is the code for this, the hamburger menu here like doesn't exist because we said we don't want you here when this is here. And then when you get down to a certain screen size, let's pretend it's 550. Let's copy this from here. We can now kind of just switch them around and say, hey, when you get to mobile, we don't want the desktop navbar, but we do want the mobile navbar. So now, like, if we go down to a certain screen size, then desktop will have no display, and then the hamburger menu will have a default display. So that's kind of how you like switch them out. You just switch up their like display properties. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, for sure. Cool.
Could you post this HTML and CSS file
Yeah.
after the lecture? Yeah.
Yes, I can zip everything and send it to you guys. Cool. So yeah, so last thing is good practice when it comes to CSS, just like any other language. Like it's, there's a few like things that you should probably follow just so that when someone else is looking through your code, they have like an easier time. And if you come back to it after a long night of coding, you don't confuse yourself. But yeah, basically, oh, this one's a fun one. Did Alex already go over DevTools with you guys? I don't imagine he has. But... Okay. So basically, DevTools, like I don't know if you guys have done this before, but like you can do all sorts of fun things on like a web page. You can change the values and make it look different on like any website really. And you can either do that by right-clicking, pressing inspect, or you can do Command/Control-Shift-C, and then it brings you to like this panel. Basically, DevTools allow you to dig into the DOM of a website. So what that means is that you can basically inspect like what every element on every website is doing, which is super powerful. And also like in here, you can log stuff to your console. You can look at like, it's a bad example, but you can see network, which is like API calls and all of this like wild stuff that's going on. And yeah, it's very nice. Wow. But yeah, so like when you're doing development with CSS, I kind of mentioned earlier to you guys about specificity and how some things can kind of conflict, right? So it's really nice to have like this DevTool panel to show you like what exactly is going on in your code. And the nice thing is every browser has it. So Safari, Firefox, they all have DevTools. They all look a little bit different, but like they're generally the same. And like I said, it's good for dealing with like specificity problems. So if we actually, let's go back into our, oh, it's not right. Let's go back into here. And where was I? Okay. Let's say we have one box words. Okay. Nice. So here we have like two different selectors, right? And then we want to be like, oh, like what if I was trying to make this red, right? And I just like stupidly decided to put this in here and I didn't realize that this was making it blue. So what I can do is notice how if we select, like if you click on this icon, you can like directly select elements. You can click on it and it highlights it in here. And then here in element styles, you can see like where everything went wrong. So basically it crosses out like this color red, which is in cascade.css line 31, technically 32, I don't know why it does that. And then it says, oh, this is like what is actually happening. It's blue because of line 34, right? So this is really nice because you can also like toggle stuff on and on. So if you say, oh, like, is this really the problem? And you check, you untoggle it and it uncrosses out this one, showing that like this one is the next one in line, right? So yeah, it's really nice. It solved a lot of problems for me just because it shows you literally everything. And when it comes to like looking at margins and padding and everything, you can also see like for every element, it has like this box model down here, which I think you guys covered last lesson. And it shows you all the like different properties of it. So if something like isn't positioned right, you can always go in and look and be like, oh, like wait, what, you know, why is this happening, and like what properties do I need to change? So yeah, this is very nice. And as you continue to do web development, you'll get like a lot of use out of it, and it'll probably save your life a few times here and there. But yeah, let's see, where were we? Okay, more good practices. So that's one good practice. I count that as the goodest practice, is using DevTools, because it saves you a lot of time. Then next we have a few more. I don't know why I didn't label these, but basically this one here, combine redundant code. So let's say you have H1, box, and words all have color green. You can just give them commas in between the selector names, and then it'll style all of them at the same time, just so you don't have to like go through and like do all of them separately, and it takes up a lot more code. Right here, this one basically means like put your CSS kind of in the order of the elements on the page in HTML. So like the content, like the styling for the main content would go like above the styling for the footer, just so that, you know, when you're going back to look for different like selectors, you kind of have like a way to estimate where things are. And then you can also comment in CSS, which I've been doing. It's just denoted by like the open and closed slash and asterisk. Yeah, and then lastly, using multiple classes. This one basically means like, maybe you guys noticed earlier, like I had a bunch of repeating elements that were all the same except for like one of them. And I think you can see that in in here. So actually I just deleted it, so special. All of the ovals have like the same kind of styling, except we want, okay, that's a horrible example actually. But when we give this double class names, then we can select it and say oval.special. And then that way, like, you know, if you didn't do this and you just like, if you just gave this a like completely new class name, like just special, then you would have to go back to ovals properties and copy all of this to make it look right. Because notice here, like it's not styled anymore. You'd have to copy all of this. Oh no, now it looks right. But you know, in code, you'd never really want to like reuse. I mean, sorry, you never want to be redundant. So if there's something that you can reuse, then usually there's like a way to get around it. So if you give it the same name, just append it with another class, then you can say .oval special. And it still has the oval property, so it's not going to change. And then you can, from here, you can say like, I want the text to be purple, and it should do it for you. So yeah, that's just a way to cut out code that is unnecessary. So yeah, I think that's all. Do you guys have any questions about the content, any of it that I went over? Okay. Okay, yeah, if you guys have questions after, feel free to stay. Yeah, so no homework release, but first project is out. Basically, I believe, let's see. So the first project I think is just a basic, let's locate. I think is a personal website. Okay, what? Okay, you know what? I'll send you guys a project link after. I don't want to locate it on camera, but it's basically building a personal website. It's gonna be pretty useful just because, hey, like a personal website, you can use that like for yourself, like in your professional development, and it is also a project. So it's kind of like killing two birds with one stone. So yeah, that's what it'll be, and I will send you guys a link to the project spec. And I think it is due in a week, which is next Monday, so March 8th. And I think we're going to be hosting a project party on Friday. So feel free to come through and ask us for help and do work together and like share ideas, bounce them off each other. So yeah, I think that is all. If you have questions, feel free to stay after and ask. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for coming, and I hope this was not confusing and you learned something. Awesome.